Hello everyone, today we talk about the development of 12th century German monarchy. I think when talking about the history of Germany, one of the most important topics of all revolves around the full medieval ages, so in the high and low Middle Ages, the construction, or better, the failure in the construction of a solid German monarchy and a national monarchy like you can see instead in the kingdoms of France, of England, and other entities both in southern or eastern Europe even. Germany remains a kind of a fragmented area from a certain point onwards, and definitely the moment in which things could change towards the evolution of a national monarchy, like in the English and French direction, occurs definitely during the 12th century. As we know, it's going to be a failure. The creation of a German centralized monarchy basically fails into the 13th century. And what we can see objectively is that Germany will not have a true monarchy in a national sense until the contemporary era in the 70s of the 19th century. This doesn't mean that Germany won't have certain monarchies. Actually, we can't call them monarchies at this point, like the Habsburgs or later the Hohenzollern. Who incidentally emerged exactly during the period of greater fragmentation of the medieval politics, that is, the second half of the 13th century, and that, however, paradoxically developed their own monarchies outside the German borders, because the Prussians went east, and the Austrians too, actually, and it was eventually only the Hohenzollern, so the Prussian dynasty, eventually to achieve the goal of the unification of Germany, which, however, would remain and still is, technically speaking, as a federal government, more of a group of states. This is what's behind the German Länder, ideologically, historically, juridically, etc. And not a unique block of a strongly centralized kingdom, like, for instance, in the French case. And this would confer different. I'm not saying relatively saying that it's better or worse. I don't want to express a judgment like that. And it also depends largely on the historical period, because obviously it was good for France to have a centralized monarchy from an early age. France could basically fail as well as Germany at a point. In this sense, Eastern and Western Francia, especially in the post-Carolingian period, are extremely interesting, because paradoxically, the stronger entity in post-Carolingian times with the Ottonian dynasty had been Germany, and not France. France seemed as a kingdom to be choked at a point, and to be aborted like the Burgundian kingdom, or even the Italian one, towards a centralized direction. And eventually, during the modern era, France is this very big entity that actually was the major power, essentially, in the European soil. At least in the West, because during modern age we have the rise of the Ottomans, etc. But what I'm saying is that at the same time, Germany, together with Italy, basically becomes the battlefield of Europe, exactly because this central European region, from a longitudinal point of view, that is from Germany to Italy, was a patchwork of many small princely states or city-states sometimes that had no political unity, and that's why we call, in fact, during the modern age, especially the late modern era, Germany and Italy, so-called weak areas of Europe. Incidentally, these two countries went towards a similar fate, even temporally speaking, regarding their unification, even though there was a fundamental difference, that is that the Germans remained German ruled during the modern age. The Italians, even those who weren't directly under foreign domination, still were part of a, of a political address that was decided by other countries. This last point is also connected to certain German principalities, so I don't want to stress differences so categorically, but what I want to mean is that what happened in the 12th century eventually came to influence, in 12th century in Germany, came to influence largely the history not just of Central Europe, but of the whole Europe as a political system. And the 12th century is interesting from this point of view, because what was decided there was essentially whether a German monarchy could make it to exist or not. And telling the truth, there were good premises. I mean, Germany wasn't, and we will be seeing it right now, as a very centrally oriented country from a political point of view. There was a tradition that kind of oared backwards towards that compared to that direction, but definitely were quite good substantial premises that could be very well exploited at a point, and this point was lays essentially in the kingdom of Frederick I of Swabia, also known of Hohenstaufen, also known as Barbarossa, who was in fact an enormously powerful sovereign at this time in Europe, actually the most powerful one, without too many exaggeration. And let's say that, however, the constitutional asset of Germany was different compared to the rest of Europe in many ways. Substantially, there was a transformation in German politics occurring into this time that didn't just start from the Hohenstaufen, that however backed that towards a very peculiar direction. But the German kingdom had been born with very peculiar characteristics into the High Middle Ages. Essentially, Germany was born from the Eastern Carolingian Francia, so this eastern region that became of Central Europe, of dominantly Germanic or ethnicity and language and traditions that starts to be identified exactly during the disgregation of the post-Carolingian times as a something on its own that had really not ever been, because this area of Central Europe was called Germany already since the Roman times, but essentially it lacked until up to that point a common political unity. There was no, even probably at a certain point, not even a concrete national identity, meaning that we say, yeah, but we're kind of Germanic, so they consider themselves akin. Yes, but that was not enough to build something greater. We can argue that until the Carolingian conquest of Germany, or better, what was left, because the Franks actually began to invade and colonize Germany, especially in the southwestern part, since the 6th century, but Saxony, so northern Germany, mostly was kind of was autonomous until Charlemagne didn't conquer the Saxons. Was more conceived by its inhabitants as not even as a group, as a political unit, but as essentially a group of tribes, of peoples, variously interacting within each other, and probably with some interest in common, with definitely certain traditions. Think about language, think about the German epics, think about a lot of things that really existed there. But that had no real border at that point, because what border could you find, for instance, with the Jutland Peninsula, with Denmark? Or even in this whole Germanic picture with the Scandinavians, or even with the Anglo-Saxons. I mean, it was more of a greater Germanic world with a very weak political constrictions than, in fact, a unique bloc. It wasn't conceived as such. And it's only through the disgregation of the Carolingian Empire that this Eastern Bloc goes basically in the hands of a king. That becomes the Eastern Frankish king, so this was conceived as Kingdom of the Eastern Franks, and starts to be beginning to be addressed in sources exactly at that time as a Teutonic um, kingdom, which means Teutonic comes from the word theod, which means people, and therefore there was even the Teutonic language, etc. Especially in and it was a kind of an elitism in many ways, meaning that the average of population didn't conceive themselves as such, but it's especially from the cultural centers of cultures and cultural elites of Germany that at this point this kind of per, pale perceived identity began to be accepted, at least at certain levels. Now the problem is that Germany, even at that time, being a kingdom, was essentially divided into groups of peoples, let's say, that think about the Saxons, think about the Thuringians and the Swabians and the Bavars, etc. So there were groups that essentially had a regional um, identity that was marked at that time already for things like geographical borders that in Germany were usually the very deep forests that still existed in there. Germany had been colonized by the Franks, and who had kind of worked in rendering Germany a place capable of some economical production, but Germany as a whole was a kind of a very uh, primitive and hostile environment in many ways, still not hugely different from Roman times. So this kind of the different peoples that made it up were still divided by things like forests, and would still develop a sense of unity that mostly laid its foundations on the base of the old ethnical divisions, rather than a commonly perceived German identity. And towards the the lower Middle Ages, so at this time we arrive at the 12th century, this ethnical groups that weren't really still as such, meaning it's not that the Saxons retained a sort of a national identity on the base that they were Saxons, but there were aristocracies that had begun to rise from the original class of freemen that after the Carolingian conquest basically had impoverished and fitted into this more stratified social asset that feudalism, the Frankish feudalism implied, began to claim certain unity still on the old ethnical base that at this point was more of a geographic one, telling the truth, and dictated in fact by the same geographic borders, but essentially not having much to do with the ethnical origins. Also because these aristocracies within Germany began even to intermarry quite a lot, because obviously Germany was slowly rising, so the idea of an expansion and of Germany as a socio-economical system pushed necessarily the guys who lived only in their own region to begin getting interested politically and militarily in the events of old Germany. During the Ottonians, Germany was still divided in this sense, but it was the leading country in Western Europe in terms of excuse me, of expansionism, and of think about the reconquest of Italy, and so it was a kind of a coming together of all these German aristocracies for a common aim, and therefore they began to know each other and to recognize themselves more as Germans rather than Westphalians or Swabians and so on. And this social stratification brought expressly, a very different form of organization that eventually abandoned the ancient ethnical base and began to focus in a feudal sense over the territorial constructions of domains on the base of land owning mostly, and therefore expanding on the base of certain rules and frames that really belonged to feudal society, and which at that time was being backed by the Hohenstaufen, because at this point you can see that the central rule is still weak in Germany. I mean, before the Hohenstaufen, Germany was pretty much in a quite unruly place. There were lots of new aristocracies rising, very disorderly. They already had their own ambitions, and they were both lay and ecclesiastical aristocracies, because out of and the reason why there were why bishops and other ecclesiastical figures of Germany were so powerful politically and even militarily speaking was a consequence of the lack of a central power that that could keep the church more framed into a social system with and its relative hierarchy. Therefore, everybody who had power basically was trying to expand it at its own benefit. And in this in this landscape, obviously, there was no great interest at having a strong ruler at that point that could rise over all these aristocracies and tie them down and stemming their expansionistic their expansions in general. However, there was also traditionally the idea that Germany was a kingdom from the Carolingian times, and there had always been kings, because kings, even if weak, were kind of needed to some extent, because obviously the king could be used by the same aristocracies to receive legitimization, to intervene against rivals. Therefore, the German monarchy begins to rise, and to obviously aim from its side to build something more centralized than this monarchy had essentially used to be. One of the major problems of monarchs is that they should be powerful, and this time didn't even exist a strong system of recruitment in Germany, because theoretically speaking it was the ancient Frankish Carolingian system of Germanic society of the early Middle Ages, for which the king is king because he's put on there mostly to do to wage war, and therefore theoretically all the Germanic freemen have to participate to the army and to follow him for actually as a privilege, because it wasn't considered as an imposition, because in the ancient times for a German it was obvious to participate to warfare, and they just needed a guide that could make them achieve that. Now things were quite different, because behind the the alleged traditionalism of these German aristocracies, who said that they weren't obliged to follow the king if they had not wanted it, because they were free in the ancient fashion of the Germanic warriors. The political situation really required sometimes to wage war on a large scale. It was difficult to do that with a central authority. This is a time, by the way, in which the Germans waged war, first of all within against the other, but sometimes they had also to face external threats. I mean, the Germans had to fight against the Hungars and later the Hungarians, with the Slavs of the East, sometimes with the French. I mean, with the Danes. They were theoretically in charge of Italy, so there was a broader international picture that even the kind of apparently uninterested German aristocracies at this point couldn't ignore, because it could be potentially fruitful, and they could benefit from a good international policy led by a German king. So very slowly, this idea of the monarchy emerges also in Germany as something more centralized. Now the problem is that, and by the way, remember always that it's not that the German monarch was something detached from the rest of the nobility. He was a member of the nobility, so it's obvious that the means that were put in the construction of especially of certain dynasties were obviously largely private resources. Yet there was also the idea that there had to be a sort of collective effort, so that theoretically all the aristocracies had to contribute to the king's efforts, because the king was chosen by God, because he had certain rights as well. And even if it was practically an extremely strong centralized authority, the German crown had certain structures that could be strengthened and developed in order to extend its power all over the country at this point. There was the potential in the 12th century. And therefore, even if there weren't particular ideal and institutional convergences, I mean, even if there were, it was still difficult to make everyone working in the same direction, and the German kings were definitely aware of that. So, as it often happens, also in political systems, there is usually a dual, you know, a two-side. There are two sides usually fighting one against the other broadly. Naturally, the political situation, the political struggle in Germany had many more sides and protagonists. Obviously, it also depends on which scale you're talking, because as as a great German prince, you can maybe to support a king in its own enterprises, maybe abroad, but maybe in Germany you have locally certain interests that go in the other direction. So it was an extremely complicated system, which, however, at this point, considering the social and economical basis of it that weren't enormously developed, could still be easily, could still easily be converged towards a unitary direction. And this is obviously what the monarchy was trying to do. And the dual side was the one that are usually called Swabian and Guelph, or Ghibelline and Guelph. Ghibelline and Guelph were two names telling the truth that were invented in Italy to basically define a side that was pro. It's kind of emerged from the struggles of investitures at a late stage, however. To define Ghibellines from the German Weiblingen, it was the the origin, the place of origin or the main castle of the Hohenstaufen at this point, and the Welfs, or Welfen in German, were in fact the other side that was more supportive of the papacy, but not because they particularly liked the papacy, but because they wanted to go against the Hohenstaufen at this point. And therefore remain in Germany, and obviously not being particularly thrilled by the papacy intervening in their own affairs, but finding themselves into agreement with the Pope when it was needed to wage war against the Emperor and to revolt against him in Germany. And this was also, this division was indeed very consumed a large quantity of resources in the process, in the attempt of building a German monarchy. Was a lot of attrition in this sense, and the same direct intervention in German affairs from Papal Rome was also another big problem, because usually the Pope would have to decide who would rise to the German throne at a point, because if anything, this monarch would have had to eventually go in Rome as king of the Germans and king of the Romans, and to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the same Pope. So it wasn't an easy process, the one of the attempt of building a German national monarchy, centralized monarchy at least, because there were lots of people who didn't want to. The Italians didn't want that, because they didn't want to have Germans in Italy ruling them. The German princes didn't want an emperor to ask them taxes and military retinues to wage war, because they wanted to do that on their own for their own domains. There were also external enemies, like the French usually, and other powers. So let's say that Germany probably had very good potential, but this was stamped and rendered useless at a point by people and institutions that actively fought against the process of of the centralization of German monarchy. So you can perceive evidently also the general instability that this would lead to, because in order to build a monarchy you can't really start from scratch, or pretend that all of a sudden a new monarchy is created. Instability implies also that if you have to fight a war continuously, either in Italy or in Germany, you can't dedicate to civil matters. You have to spend a huge amount of resources just for other things, and also kings didn't last forever, so it was they could be deposed or even killed. So this would mean that the new king would have to start from scratch several of the things that its predecessor had not managed to launch in a certain way. And all this in the European continent that was quite fastly on the rise, and was seeing the rise of very aggressive political actors like the French king, as we've seen, but also the strengthening of other monarchies. The Germans had many troubles with Hungary, as we were recalling. There would be many problems in general also with you think about the feudal world and all the dynastic problems themselves. The dynastic problems were of excruciating importance for gaining lands and properties, the German monarchy being elective, but still, being tied to all this very intricate net of familiar relations between all the various aristocracies. So uh, it's within this pretty messed up um, uh, situation that Frederick I rose to power, and it's interesting because Frederick descended both from the Ghibellines and the Welfs, um, well, from the Welf side, from his mother's side. He was a king that, after some problems that had occurred previously, at the beginning of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, and especially before with the Salian dynasty, was for the first time accepted by a substantial aristocratic group that, however, hadn't supported him for free, but this was a kind of a standard for Germanic kings to for the kings of Germany to have to pay back those who had paid him to rise to the throne, which incidentally was a kind of paradox, because the German kings wanted to be elected to centralize power, both for, it's difficult to say mostly for their own dynasty, but in practice it was largely also because of that. But at the same time, in order to be elected, they couldn't avoid to make promises to the German electors, that he would have had eventually to maintain, because this gives you the dimension of how the German monarchical power was dependent on largely on the will of the German aristocracy. So you kind of had to do, it's kind of mafia in many ways. If you don't do what I help you, but if you don't do what I promised you to, you promised me to do, I'm gonna, take away all the power from you and maybe start even a war against you. So it was not a child's play, definitely. And the figure of Frederick the First and is a figure that stands into medieval history for its power. And in this sense, we have to think that very substantial part of the resources that he achieved um, to to draw from were largely private resources of his. Frederick had not differently from what had happened, for instance, for the Ottonians, with Otto the Great, a huge patrimony that derived from its familiar possessions. And we're talking about properties like lands, obviously, and castles. The 12th century is the moment in which military engineering in the West brutally accelerates, castles becoming extremely more important and extremely more capable of controlling the territory. They began to be part of great strategical territorial constructions that are based on land power and all these castles that dotted the various domains. So in this sense, the Hohenstaufen dynasty had worked really hard to ensure to itself a base to start from in order to carry out and carry on a monarchical policy, and we can say that we can even see many occasions how it wasn't much of a public effort overall for which the German monarchs rose to power, but rather from their um, previous possessions. Um, and uh, and Frederick I could achieve its position thanks to what his ancestors had done before him with largely private means. And when we say private means, we obviously mean the even illegal means. I mean, anti-public means in many ways, in the sense that the Hohenstaufen wanted to carry out, when they were kings, a public policy. They wanted to be recognized as a central authority, but in order to achieve their power, they had used a political and military dialectics that wasn't definitely doing good to the public authority itself. But it's still important that the Hohenstaufen's resources were put to use into a monarchical sense, and that we had this dynasty of low medieval Europe that was capable of achieving so much before eventually decline, falling, and and leaving a vacuum into the political landscape of Germany that was eventually filled by many other smaller powers that couldn't really work together as singularly as the promoters of a renewed royal, and let's not even talk about imperial authority. So what the Hohenstaufen did, and what Frederick I actually is mostly responsible for, was the importation of the French feudalism into Germany. Why was this? Well, French feudalism was the most developed at that time. France was the most advanced country, rising at that point in Western Europe as a single political entity. Feudalism had been, it's indeed a decentralized political system, but it still allows to move singular blocks of political and military of military power that are extremely consistent, so that you can entrust very large amount of lands to a single vassal, and that's a kind of a double-edged sword, because from one side you can rely on such a heavy force as long as it's loyal, but in the other instance it can even turn against you. But the main problem with Frederick at this point was needing troops to wage wars in Italy and to pursue its universal imperialistic aims. And feudalism was an extremely effective way to provide a military elite. Now, as we said, the Germans had known Frankish feudalism since the conquest of Saxony by Charles the Great. But German feudalism had kind of remained very weak. It was a more kind of a clientelar system, like it already existed in part in Germany before, and it had indeed progressively stratified the German society, as we've seen, but it had not achieved to reach the levels of French society, in which you had nobles who had a huge amount of land, single nobles who had a huge amount of land and could have, therefore a very large military retinue of trained elite professionals of war who could follow in turn the king, not just his lord, but not just the lord, but their king to battle. So, and that's what Frederick needed. Now, the only problem with Germany is that Germany wasn't as wealthy as France. The social system was Germany was poorer on average as a whole system. Plus, it had a much more egalitarian distribution of resources than France. it's not that the Germans were egalitarian, there were always aristocracies governing, but they weren't as powerful aristocracies like the one of France. They didn't have as much land as France. Now, the 12th century Germany is incidentally also a time of great economical expansion of Germany itself. There are a lot of bonifications, of deforestations. Germany expands within and outside its borders. And much of this expansion was controlled and guided by the aristocracy and partly also by the king. So this was a moment in which the kings could influence the distribution of resources within the hands of some. And by favoring certain nobles instead of others, the Hohenstaufen basically tended to stratify the German aristocracy by enclosing, in a certain sense, an elite of aristocrats that were even entrusted with institutional roles as electors, for instance, and leaving the rest of the nobility behind, so that the feudal hierarchy could be formed also in Germany through the assignation of certain lands, of certain privileges. This meant that Germany could be more easily controlled by the Hohenstaufen and could basically follow more quickly its developments and intervening by, entrusting the situation to a single powerful vassal and not having to deal with all the local aristocracies as one that were very difficult to control. This is, a policy that has been used many times into history in order to make more order. Even even when concentrating an exceeding amount of power into the hands of a chosen favorite. And at this point, therefore, also the mobility towards the upper levels of societies was kind of blocked, and those who were not princes of the empire, even if they were technically part of the broad vassalic system in contact with the king, were, however, destined to be absorbed into the lordship of the major aristocrats of Germany and being tied to them, and theoretically obeying to them. And this was incredibly useful for Germany because it practically meant that at this point, especially the whole process of for instance, of the German election, etc., was kind of more ordered compared to before. It was still a mess, technically speaking, because these prince electors were constantly fighting one against another. But at least there was a sort of alveum into which German politics could move more orderly and could provide theoretically more effective sovereigns. By the way, the Hohenstaufen were rising on their own as the leading German dynasty, even in private terms. So obviously these all went not just for favoring certain vassals and just for the sake of it, but it was meant to create a verticalization of society at the top of which the Hohenstaufen could regulate everything that was below them. This was the ideal theoretically, but the practice of German politics was very different. First of all, because the German princes never eventually abandoned the reluctancy to offer aid to the crown. There was a progressive shift towards the participation to military to expeditions, especially the ones into Italy that the Barbarossa waged a lot of times, and that the German nobility was really not interested in. which was the idea that the military retinues theoretically owed by the German vassals to the king could be commutated into monetary contributions. This was kind of a mixed thing because there were certain German principalities that still had to contribute with actual knights or mercenaries. At least others could instead just pay. It all depended on the local tradition and what the relation with the royal power was at that moment. So you can understand all these phase of contractation um, of particularism that still existed into the political German political dialectics, um, and and this wouldn't help overall the system. But it kind of gave, for a certain time, the Hohenstaufen the resources to wage a policy of universal breadth. Um, Now there is much debate whether the Hohenstaufen actually could um, mm, set permanent basis for a German national monarchy like the rest of Europe. A lot of criticism is devoted especially to um, the German politics of Frederick Barbarossa, especially towards his cousin Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony, who was in contrast with. There will be a lot to talk about this chapter, which I will surely do in another video. But the point is, at that point, it wasn't really that Henry Lyon was a great rebel of Barbarossa. There's been a bit too much over um, too much emphasis sometimes to this character of the whole story. But um, the main criticism is towards the fact that Barbarossa at a point could crush the Duke of Saxony by confiscating his own domains, and he didn't do that. So this is why I should talk about it, because things are more complicated than that. But seemingly the Duke of Saxony was practically, together with Bavaria, the main wealth or wealth power in Germany. So they were the main competitors of the Hohenstaufen of the Swabian dynasty into Germany. So people say if Barbarossa had wiped out Saxony, it was a consistent power at that time, more than Bavaria, he could have definitely given solid foundations for the development of a German monarchy, because the Saxon resources, together with the Swabian ones, could have been enough to crash the resistance of the whole aristocracy. Um, the the point is that he didn't do that, and it's not just about that, but it's also about the fact that Barbarossa had these huge ambitions that were kind of legitimate because he was Holy Roman Emperor and he had the means to pursue, for instance, Mediterranean politics that implied ruling Italy, that was the wealthiest place in Europe, and expanding even to the Kingdom of Sicily in order to reach Constantinople. And there is a point in which he made his son Henry marrying the last heiress of the Norman Sicilian kingdom by obtaining it, and there is a point at which the Germans even arrived at the gates of Constantinople, were about to take it, practically, but they didn't. They didn't do it. And therefore, it's hard to tell, what would have been best. In my opinion, the universalistic and imperial ambition of Barbarossa was indeed the cause of the lack of a German centralized monarchy during the Low Middle Ages, but at the same time, it was kind of worth considering the situation. In by talking now, we have this impression that the whole universalistic policy basically was to be abandoned because it was about to fail anyway in perspective. But telling the truth, at the time of the 12th century, it wasn't really the case. There was still the consistent possibility of creating a Mediterranean empire, of reuniting East and West, and the Hohenstaufen were probably the ones who came the closest to achieve that. Which, if you think about it, is amazing because they had started as minor vassals in the 11th century. In the 12th century, they were like the most powerful sovereigns in the West. So this story, in perspective, the Germans basically lost the opportunity of concentrating all these resources in the construction of a German monarchy, like the one of France and England, that have could been theoretically even more powerful than than these ones, telling the truth, because Germany could have been poorer than France, but definitely was very heavily populated. It had a lot of potential for expansion. It was well placed. Geographically speaking, was close to Italy. It could could expand into various directions. It had potential even in the North Sea, in the Baltic Sea, telling the truth also towards the east with on the Baltic countries. They could regulate many things. Think that Barbarossa technically inherited dynastically through his marriage the kingdom of Burgundy, so even expanding westwards towards France. I think that it is true. I think that both positions are actually right. It is true that the Hohenstaufen missed the chance to invest more resources, probably safer resources, on the construction of a German national monarchy, but at the same time they were going towards something greater that, if achieved, could have really remunerated them. And this is something you see better, especially in the projects of Frederick II, the nephew of the grandson of Frederick I, because his ideal was basically ruling from Rome, from the center of the Christian world, from a Western perspective, and think in Germany as just a peripheral province of a huge empire that had technically to be the revival of the old Roman one. So in my opinion, it's a very difficult thing to judge overall. You can't truly say how the path should have gone to. I I think, however, it's important historically to think that both ways were feasible. Trying to do the two things at once made it a failure, but there were also other events that eventually created problems. Chiefly the fact that there was a dynastic crisis of the Hohenstaufen between with the minority of Frederick II, with weaker rulers before. Think about Philip of Swabia. There were also many problems with France, etc. So they kind of were the Hohenstaufen kind of were unlucky, and especially between the end of the 12th century and the beginning of the 13th centuries, they lacked a continuous, especially a continuous German policy, because Frederick had been defeated in famously at the Battle of Legnano against the Lombard League, and that had to basically to stem his own ambitions, to subdue Italy, but that was still something that Frederick II could have done, at least that he tried to. There is the fact that Saint Frederick died in the Third Crusade. Who knows what in the Third Crusade Frederick might have achieved in terms of conquests and dominions that could have brought new resources to the Holy Roman Empire and to the Hohenstaufen rule in Germany as well in Mediterranean. There is to consider the fact that Henry VI had inherited the kingdom of Sicily, died young, and therefore Frederick II was a minor when and Otto of Brunswick, who was a wealth, became king of Germany, and there is also the fact that Frederick II had been raised technically as a son, as an adoptive son of the Pope, and that therefore he tried to stem originally the ambitions of the Hohenstaufen. The papacy that indeed at the beginning of the 13th century was a huge, immense political power that could decide simply, what happened in every single European, Western European kingdom. So lots of problems that indeed didn't favor the construction of a building of a monarchical asset into of a solid monarchical asset into Germany. There is to say another thing though that I don't know what you think about it. Let me know about it. It's I kind of started for personal reasons, and different reasons from an interest directed towards the Hohenstaufen, the second half of the 13th century in Germany, and now the first half of the 14th. And what I noticed, in my opinion, is that there is a general tendency in all the historiography I've read to say that after the Hohenstaufen, the end of the Hohenstaufen, the German monarchy was kind of it couldn't be rebuilt anymore because there weren't enough resources, that the German princes had expanded during the crisis, that the monarchs who were elected didn't have enough personal resources to cope with all this princely power. But telling the truth, if you look at the German perspective in general, you can sense that paradoxically, even in the 14th century and in the mess that it was from a political point of view, there were certain powers that are normally recognized as weak, like the Habsburgs, the Luxembourgs, or the Wittelsbach. Well, the Wittelsbach were actually weak, but the Habsburgs and the Luxembourgs especially had quite of a power already in the 14th century. The Habsburgs, even in the end of the 13th century, there is a moment between the end of the 13th and the beginning of the 14th century in which nominally the Habsburgs became even kings of Bohemia and of Poland. I mean, nominally speaking. Then things also in that case went wrong because eventually there are a bunch of assassinations, the Habsburgs go into a crisis, but I mean, these were systems that theoretically could build something stronger, and which, by the way, consequently deeply alarmed the local German aristocracy. So what I think, however, is that Germany, throughout all this period, had a huge potential to be used in order to build the German monarchy. It is true that this potential was used partly in Germany, considering it as a system as a whole, also by the opponents of this project. So and that explains largely why the whole thing failed. Then other environmental factors didn't help, just like the Black Death or the general recession in the first half of the 14th century. But there is the drama of the fall of the Hohenstaufen, as if afterwards, there was a kind of total anarchy and no possibility of building anything at all. But telling the truth, especially the 14th century and the period between the Hohenstaufen and the Golden Bull, actually show a certain resilience of the German political system in many ways. Even the same electors that always played this messy game between, well, who paid more and who opposed the election, who considered it as illegal, and then the Pope intervened, and then other sovereigns, etc. All this mess were accompanied by, certain other, intentions and kind of awareness of the potential of a central authority that really let me personally, because this is just a personal impression, let me really think about whether the possibility of having a German monarchy wasn't something so far at that point. And remembering at the beginning of the video when I said that Germany eventually remained always German ruled, different from Italy, even if these two regions were divided in the same way. Actually, Germany was much more divided than Italy. But yet, this Germanic kingdom kind of remained standing. It's paradoxical, even after the Napoleonic era, and think about the the debate into German 19th century society on whether Germany had to be unified by either by the Habsburgs or the Hohenzollern, and many other hints. Let me suggest that theoretically the Germans kind of preferred this as a political form that doesn't necessarily express a great weakness. It's true that division creates weakness sometimes, but there are also different kind of divisions. One thing is like the Italian regional states that were like the most powerful thing on the world altogether, and that instead during the Italian wars basically ended up for killing each other and suiciding themselves collectively, while Spain, France and Austria were invading and trying to seize the Italian power. So in Germany this didn't happen. There was a great deal of division, of messy political situation, but at the same time were lots of resources that were kind of put in motion within the same system that ended, in a certain sense, even to build sort of antibodies against political against external threats. For instance, who did invade Germany and who did succeed? The French tried it, the Swedish tried it, but eventually they didn't make it. Yes, during Napoleon, the French conquered Germany famously, but after that, I mean before that, aside from that an exception, the Holy Roman Empire kind of remained, or even after its end in the post-Napoleonic period, it kind of remained something untouched, something working on its own, something in certain cases even being quite advanced. Germany, for instance, during the 16th century was the most advanced country in the world, technologically speaking, together with Italy. Now, this is pretty amazing for a country that has no central authority. And even the fact that the other country was Italy, that was also fragmented, tells you that probably in that moment of European history, possibly the failure of a German monarchy, and coming back to our perspective, wasn't even something so bad, because the Germans maintained eventually that federative political tradition that had basically been at the roots of their own culture and tradition, and kind of made possible the idea that there was an empire with many people that were theoretically all free and that all had rights, and that this, yeah, could create division in fact, but was still, something very even humanly important from a juridical point of view and theory of personal and communitary rights, that has left very strong traces even in German culture up to today. Mm. Then obviously were lots of problems. Think about the 100 Years' War, but that was mostly a confessional problem that, at the time of Frederick Barbarossa wasn't there. So what I'm saying is that centralized monarchies sometimes tend to swallow even exceedingly, let's say, individual freedoms. This is something that in France they earned quite the hard way. Think about southern France conquered during the Albigensian Crusade, or think about other areas of centralized monarchies that up to a certain time had lived kind of autonomously and prosperously, and that at a certain point were conquered and razed to the ground, and everything went back to the capital, to the center. So this is why you look at sovereigns like Louis XIV and you say, oh, look at France, the might of modern Europe, this hegemonic power in continental Europe that against whom everybody basically had to fight because it was so powerful, so centralized that it was about to conquer everything. And yet, that's the same France that less than a century after saw the outbreak of some of the most devastating revolutions that history remembers. For saying that it was probably also a rigged system at a certain point, a system that laid its roots in the progressive expansion of the properly French nation over all these other regional entities that surrounded it, and that had brought to social stratification, inequality, etc. Even if, the France of Ancien Regime and also later enormously contributed to Western civilization in culture, art, science, even militarily in this sense. So I usually never ask this, but I would really like to know your opinion. I will begin to ask more frequently your opinion. What do you think it was really best for Germany at this point? That in the 12th century the Hohenstaufen had made it to centralize it, maybe even abandoning the universal politics, the Mediterranean politics, or do you think maybe it was paradoxically better for Germany and Europe that Germany emerged culturally the way it is? I just leave it to you. So for the rest, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you like, please share it or leave a like, otherwise subscribe to my channel. And if you have any questions, well, feel free to ask. For now, it's all. I thank you once again very much for listening. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.